Hey everybody, Jake Bryant here, coming in for another podcast for Preventative Health Movement. I'm going to be doing something a little different today, which is to come through and walk through processes that I've used over the last 7 or 8 years of different training styles and the intricate details around what I think about and how I tune into the body. This goes from mobility, it goes through to strengthening, it goes through regulation, it goes through awareness, and also the absolute complexities that embark on the journey of health. Because as you start to get older, or like myself, you go through injury, maybe potentially older and having gone through injury, you realize that there's some pretty sophisticated mechanisms within the body, and the support or the detail that things were explained to me while going through that process was somewhat lacking, in my honest opinion. I sat there and was looking for answers to understand, why am I feeling this way, or why can I not get strength back, or how are these imbalances supposed to correct themselves? What are the details? How is the structure loaded? Do I need to lengthen and strengthen? Or what is it that I need to do to reduce the soreness or the pain or the headaches or all of those sorts of things that I experience post-injury, post-surgery, and then even in that process of leading back into getting some strength, the tension that the body was under because load capacities were slightly distributed incorrectly. So how do you go through those imbalances? How do you figure out of all of the muscles that make the body, how do you find out what it is that you need to do? What are the testing processes? How do I work on these things? Is it I need to load and strengthen? Is it I need to go for a run and build endurance? Like, how's our breath work? How's our stress? How's our mental capacity? So we're going to be jumping into quite a few things. I'm going to go down to some very fine details, even around the way that the muscles in your face respond in comparison to movement, because the body structure is complex. And I think one of the things that I've realized is, because a health system is so busy and it is so overrun, there isn't actually time that when you go and you see practitioners that you have the ability to sit down and walk through an hour-long process. And it's genuinely up to you as the person wanting to get answers, your level of determination, your level of education, your level of drive and motivation to see this through as to how far you're going to get. And I used to get left very disheartened for probably 2 to 3 years. I would go and see practitioners, and there was no point where I ever didn't respect what it was that they were teaching, because it was their journey and their process, and I would get key bits of information from each person, but the understanding of the complexity of how do I take something that's out of balance, or how do I take that strength loss and build my way back to being a strong human. The difference between structural load and mobility, or strengthening versus lengthening. And as we walk through those processes, how do I become fit and strong and healthy? So welcome to what is going to be a journey of me explaining my headspace. I will probably jump, because in all honesty, this is me just having a conversation and walking through my process. Because one of the things that I found, and what I try and focus on, is I imagine the body like a triangle, and a triangle is extremely strong. And you've got your skeletal system, you've got your joints, your tendons, your ligaments, you've got your muscular system. And the way that I view it is, when the muscular system is compromised, the tendons and the joints and the skeletal system take the load for the role that muscle is meant to do. The way that I look at these things and work awareness in is, can you intentionally get a good contraction of a muscle? So if I'm coming in and I'm doing a bicep curl, can I actually feel that engagement of a bicep curl? When I do a tricep extension, can I get that tricep? If I'm trying to engage my shoulders, are my traps kicking in, or can I get that shoulder as the main muscle group? Because we spend so much time in a forward position nowadays. We spend so much time seated. We very rarely go out and explore and exercise for a long period of time. And so our sedentary lifestyle is far outweighing our active lifestyle. And what does this do to people? Like, as I walk through this journey and I walk through this process and I look at what is happening in the world around us, I see people who are having, I don't want to say identity crises, but people have lacked the mentorship and guidance of motivated, driven individuals that have taught people how to find purpose. And part of that is doing difficult things so that you can learn to overcome. It gives you a sense of purpose. And the thing I like about that within a gym environment is over time, if you stay consistent for 6 months to a year, and you don't go 0 to 100 when you start, but you find your 50% baseline, you track for your first cycle of training, which might be 4 or 6 weeks, then you see how you're going and you start to progress through your training cycles. You learn a lot about yourself. And within that, it could be you learn your strengths and your weaknesses physically. You might learn a little bit about yourself in terms of your discipline, because I just don't feel like doing it, and then all of a sudden a week's gone by. And who is it that you turn to for motivation? Who is it that you turn to for education? Who is it that you aim to become like in a healthy, driven manner, because you want to be surrounded by people that are ahead of where you are? And so when I work on coaching, I look at so many parameters. I look at somebody's sleep. I look at the base of what they consume for food, what they're doing for exercise, what their family life is like, what their work life is like, what their environment's like, how they're tracking financially, where they're at relationally with people, and then what are their dreams and what are their goals. Because we as humans, you can't really separate any of those components, and a lot of those things, if multiple of those factors are out, it can actually add stress to the body. And I'll talk about stress further, but the dynamic of what it is that requires us to be on a healthy equilibrium to function best is something that the world has really compromised in today's day and age. We are constantly getting dopamine hits from technology. We're constantly going to supermarkets and it's instant. If we want something online, we don't even have to go and get it anymore. We can just order it and it shows up. And a lot of these things take away the reward complex of doing something difficult. And it translates across into our conversations that we have with our friends, our family, our partners, and all of those things as well. Because learning to articulate what it is that you're understanding or what it is that you're feeling, to then be able to try and describe, to find a common plane of conversation, to then progress forward, is a really valuable skill, especially in today's day and age. I sit there and I look at youth growing up, and I look back to 100 years ago where the world hadn't opened up in terms of technology and travel, and the possibilities of what somebody could do may have been down to 1,000 things. But now there's hundreds of thousands of possibilities. You've got online marketing, you've got digital, you've got travel, you've got all of these different avenues within which you can make money. And no wonder it's taking people longer to figure out who they are, because I'm not going to be able to be a farmer or maybe till the fields or be a builder or become a sparky or work on a ship and those industrial jobs that used to be around, because now there's so many more possibilities. And it's like, wow, I've got decisions to make and some choice. And I always try and encourage people as they go through process. It's like, well, your job's either going to fund the lifestyle that you want to live, or what I've done is I've created a lifestyle that I'm happy to live and it funds me. And those balance points, you've just got to be comfortable with who you are and being okay to walk out the journey. Because I've noticed over time, and even within the fitness industry, and I've been guilty of this as well, is you see the way that somebody trains, or you see the way that somebody lives your life, and you're like, oh, I probably wouldn't have done that. And it's like, well, that's okay, but don't bag on the person because of the journey. Ask them questions to try and understand why they made that decision. And for me, character and morals are a huge part. And I know we haven't even got into the training stuff yet, but all of this comes down to the mental aspect of preparation, because if you are easily swayed, then that consistency and that long-term vision isn't actually going to be pre-established enough to hold you to get through. You might go through the rigmarole, you might do an 8-week challenge, you might come into your fitness journey and you go from that 0 to 100 and then you crash because the amount of stress that's been put on the body, and your hormones might go completely out of whack because you go into a really low calorie diet and all of your energy changes and your body just says, hey, I don't actually know what's happening here, so I'm just going to close off. And a lot of the time, it's the small, consistent things that we do on the day-to-day that actually create that compounding interest that lead us to being successful in that long term. And so for me, the key fundamentals, and I've talked about this before, but I love looking at my relationships. Have I got good people around me? Am I constantly being inspired to do more, even if it comes with difficult conversations? Finances, am I consistently increasing my education? It could be with accounting, it could be with business, it could be marketing, it could be logistics, it could be savings, investments, all of these sorts of things. My work, is it fulfilling? Do I enjoy what I do, or is it an absolute nightmare every day? Because I got into a job, I over leveraged my financial position, and now it's keeping me in that spot and I can't leave. I look at the way within which I structure my own education. How do I prepare my mind to be constantly curious? As I sit there and I look at something, and as we break down the body later, you'll see a little bit of how my mind works, but I'm curious to the nth degree. So when I meet somebody, I want to know their perspective, because that person's lifestyle has given me another perspective that I never would have experienced. Their choices, their decisions, the way they execute, their viewpoints. I want to learn and hear about those things. And for me, that's wholesome conversation, because I get to exchange my life story with theirs. And that's that to and fro, and that's that beautiful exchange, which helps me to remove possibilities that I would have had to have tried to figure out if it was for me based on their experience. And I think one of the other key components, and especially with science developing at the rate that it is, we have to intentionally go back to what it is that we know and retest that based off new data to see if the current thing still stands. And so you go back to practices that existed or started 100 years ago, and you now look at the rate within which AI and science and technology and scanners and all of these things are coming through, and we're getting a lot of information that we can probably remove a lot of what we used to think was really important as a base fundamental. And you always do the best with what you've got. And so if you are happy with where you are and you choose to stay there, that's totally okay. But then you're responsible for not looking at somebody else with greed because you settled here. And vice versa. If I'm aiming for this and I'm aiming for going huge, I want to build these businesses and I want to go harder, I want to be strong, I want to be fit and healthy, I still honor and respect the person who's got to the point where they've been like, you know what, I'm actually really content with where I'm at. And I actually genuinely envy that, because I'm not blessed with the ability to sit still. It's not how my brain works. There's no part of me that's like, relax and settle down and just sit there by the beach and drink cocktails. But the processes that we go through is understanding, it's awareness, it's being able to look at somebody else's life and understand what's important to them. Where have they come from? Where are they aiming to get to? A lot of the time, fitness is actually showing up and being able to do life rather than being six-pack shredded with massive muscles or being toned and lean. People want to be able to show up for their families. They want to be able to get through life and have fun. And most of the time we look at gym, but the proportion of people that actually come through a gym aren't, in terms of scale to the rest of the population, aren't very many. How do we show up and encourage people? And that's where I try and base my philosophy of how I go about these things. When I interact with somebody, what's their mental priorities? And based off my experience and the things that I've looked at, and I'm very lucky, one of my jobs is I run an international ministry for a group of people, and we get to travel around the world. I get introduced to cultures. I get introduced to different ways of life. And it really humbled me when I started to travel, because I started to see the way that some people do family, the way that certain countries do finance. I got to see the way that the countries that do development and growth, how they prioritize those things. And it's genuinely a beautiful thing to understand that for us to succeed, we have to complement one another. And it's not about competition, it's about sitting there with our strengths, standing side by side, and offering through conversation, experience, awareness, and progressing constantly, with also the courage and humility to admit that if something failed, we give everyone a heads up saying, man, I was so caught out, I got this wrong, scratch this progression, let's go down this line. And it's really hard because we find our identities in what it is that we do. And we find our purpose quite often in what it is that we do. I'm a fitness coach, I'm an accountant, I'm a rocket engineer, I am a quantum physicist, or there's all of these different roles that we go down, and our identity is based, and life today is so busy that there's not a lot of downtime. So not only are we not getting to switch off mentally, we're most likely going to be slightly in a stressed state, which is going to leave the body a bit rigid and a bit tense. We're probably not really going to have that much spare headspace for our partners, our friends, and our family. And so you've got to be really intentional around that, which if you don't prioritize it, weeks or months go by, and all of a sudden you realize, you're like, wow, I haven't been able to show up in the way that I wanted to. What are you going to do about it? And so it's why I like using small tools like journaling. I have a journal that I've been adding to for about 6 years, that if something significant happens or my mind gets triggered by something, I will write it down, I will date it, and I'll write down what my current interpretation of said thing is. And so that way I can go back and I'll read through it randomly at certain points of time. And it's a really cool indicator for me, because I'm like, wow, that's my perspective on that's actually really changed. And it takes a lot of letting go to allow that to happen. And so when you come into your health and your environment, which is an extremely complex part of life, the things that you can try or the places to start is what I want to talk about today. I want to go into how do I just understand a little bit about my body. We'll go and we'll talk into the structures that I talked about of the triangle before. I want to go into a little bit of sleep. I want to go into some grip strength, foot strengthening, and just some of the things that I've used to work my way back from having my ankle reconstruction. So when I did my injury back in 2000, I had slipped off monkey bars, landed on it sideways, basically got written off as a sprained ankle, and I got told to rehab it. I went through process of getting scans. They found out I had several torn ligaments and tendons. Over process, it took almost 2 years to get the surgery. I was in line, got COVID, surgery got cancelled, rebooked, got the surgery. But at that point, it had been at the 2-year mark. And one of the things that I had never realized, because I'd always got into martial arts when I was 9, got into the gym around probably 17, 18. I was always into some sort of hiking or outdoors. And one thing I learned is that it's a lot harder to repair a broken foundation than it is to maintain a good one. And so it's an encouragement that if you're young and you have the luxury of health, keep at it. Because if you lose that or something becomes compromised, it's a lot harder to get back. And every person that's had an injury will know the frustration of how complex the body is to try and re-strengthen around an area of injury to return that progress for optimal health. As you go through your phases of life and as you go through that process, your priorities slightly shift as well. And so as I came back from the surgery, I'd had my movement patterns out of balance. I had walked over my left hip for about 2 years because I couldn't hold strength in my right leg. My center of gravity, I'd shifted my center of gravity to the left of spine, and so my left side became extremely dominant and my right side became extremely weak. And what that did is turning and walking funny, my shoulders became rotated, my trap on one side was extremely tight, and I lost my structural integrity. So the way that I look at the human body is, imagine a bridge. There is the main structures that hold the bridge, and then your muscles and everything are the cars that get to drive over top of it. If the structure is compromised, so in my case the bridge was loaded left side a lot stronger, the right side is going to take a lot more wear and tear, but the left side also still has to compensate for this. And the body is extremely sophisticated because we rotate, we pivot, we twist and we turn, and we reach, we extend, we contract, we have these micro movements, and then inside of all of that, our body functions. Our organs, they do what they need to do. It's the biology of the body, it's the chemistry, it's your food you put in which fuels the body, which then aids recovery. And a lot of consumerism, especially around food, is actually run by business people. And what I mean by this is, I've worked in business since I was 18, and business people are very efficient. And what I mean by that is, we will strip back anything that's not needed to still deliver a product so that we can optimize and be as efficient as possible. And unfortunately, within food, that has also been the case. So a lot of the stuff that you see on shelves is a product that is mass produced, where optimal efficiency is the goal. There needs to be food on the shelves. How do we get it there? We might genetically engineer the food to grow faster. What actually is the cost of growing food faster? What happens to the nutrients? What happens to the soil if you're constantly putting if you're constantly putting fertilizers and chemicals and all of that stuff onto the soil? What does it actually do to the root system when you're not getting the depth? And it made me lead into learning about the network that trees and the network that things like fungi use, and how that process of integration within the soil and nutrients and conversation translates across to how the body works. So when we consume food, it enters into the mouth, it goes down into the stomach, it gets broken down by acid, it works its way through. But in each of those phases, even from the moment the food hits your tongue and in your mouth, your body starts releasing saliva. It starts to break down these foods. Sometimes it goes directly into the bloodstream, certain processes that then go through. But when you add processed food into your stomach, what's it going to do with it? Because it's not actually a natural substance. So I genuinely wiped out 90% of foods that weren't natural, and my food bill skyrocketed. And it was really, really amazing to sit there and be like, I do 80% meat and then a range of vegetables. I focus on fiber, I focus on anti-inflammatory foods, key markers being protein. And in all honesty, up until probably 4 months ago, I hadn't even been tracking my protein markers to the degree that I should have been. I went through the process of doing a genetics test, and when I then walked through that process with my nutritionist, I'd been tracking at about 1.2 grams, and she said I needed to be up at around about the 1.4 to 1.6, and that's per kg of body weight. And I was just sitting there and I was really amazed, because I've always optimized protein shakes. I've always tried to get most of my substances through food, because you get minerals and the body requires those minerals. If you think about electricity passing through wires, gold is a better conductor than copper, but because of the cost, you use a certain thing. So as you come through and you look at that, do you want to be putting gold into your body, or are you going to go for copper? And the impedance or the resistance that goes through those things is the food that you put into your body. And you can quite genuinely optimize to the nth degree to get the most out of your body, so that your health becomes more efficient, it becomes more effective. There's less resistance for your body to have to deal with. You go into your lymphatic system, you go into the way that your blood circulates around the body and delivers blood or nutrients and all of those things to the muscles and recovery systems, and how all of that works. How do I optimize those systems? And as much as I'm blowing this up very large, I'll wrap up the chat today by giving some key components that doesn't require you to know all of this, but I want people who may be frustrated on their health journey to maybe hear, wow, that's actually what I've been feeling and nobody else has put that into words. The levels of the muscles and how they work. What happens if we can't grip properly? What happens if we have weak feet? Because so many of shoes in today's world have got such thick pads that you're not actually having to rely on your sensory feedback to react or fire. And one thing that I've learned from having to walk lopsided for a few years is, man, the amount of goodness and ranges of motion that is allowed to go through comes from your feet. And you might sit there and you have an ankle injury, or you might strain a groin or pull a muscle in the back, and you notice that after a week or two of moving incorrectly, it's really hard to just limber up and just find that center of gravity that's, left of spine, right of spine. And one of the things that I like to do is always give credit where it's due. So I'll use this as a moment to go through a few of the practitioners that I've learnt from over the last 4 years that have genuinely been the main thing that's got me through this process. So I spent some time with a app called MoveU, and I went in, and these guys go down to the finest detail. They have a program and it's called Fix Your Shit. They sit there and they walk through processes, and they start with pelvic floor, they do wing scapula, they do neck mobility, they do hip alignment, and they work their way through the body to a detail that for me was really, really refreshing, because quite often I would go to practitioners and I'd be like, man, I feel like I'm a couple of degrees out and I can't load correctly, and they're like, you're paying too much attention to the details. And yes, there's a point where you need to scope out and just do, but there's also a point where if you have a bolt that's missing in that bridge structure and that's rattling, I don't want to take that for granted. I'd much rather figure out what that thing is and get that alignment back in. And it could be it's a 1 degree twist to make that structure strong. It could be that it's putting a bolt back in so that everything stays rigid. And these are kind of the balance roles between our tendons, our ligaments, our nervous system, and the way that they communicate between the muscles and reflexology, and our eyesight to movement, and how we associate how we move through space. And we predominantly will use our eyesight as the reference point. So if you've got tight muscles and your movement pattern is compromised in your neck because you don't have the mobility to go through ranges of motion, what does that do to our reflexology? Do we become uncomfortable while moving through space because of that parameter? And there's these multifaceted areas. So I broke down life before around like finances, relationships, work, all of those things. It's the same with our body. So the way that our muscles function, the way that we the way that our reflexes work, the way that our nutrition will complement the body, the way that we train, and then we can even get dominant muscles versus non-dominant. And so I like to try and sit there and be like, if I can push it, I should be able to pull it, depending on the proximity of the muscle load. But the balance point that I like to go through is, can I offset left? Can I offset right? Because we do so many things with just static bars, and our dominant side will come over. So when we come into the gym, and I started within more of the strength side of things as I worked into the fitness journey, which was how heavy can I lift? I worked off the, I should be able to deadlift double my body weight, I should be able to squat my body weight in a half, and I should be able to bench and row my body weight. And those were kind of like my key parameters. And then as I started going through, and I had a longboarding injury when I was young, and I had a really bad impact, and it caused my body to hold a lot of tension and a lot of stress. And it probably took me about a year and a half to get back to moving. And I genuinely thought I had done damage. I still have stone marks in my ribcage from this, but the dynamic of this was there was so much of an imbalance because the body had braced to impact itself, and I never provided the opportunity for it to sit there and go, Okay, I can start to function again. I'm in a safe environment. How do I do that? Let's talk about breath regulation. Let's talk about hot versus cold therapies. Let's talk about vibration and all of these different frequency responses that science is coming out with now, which is absolutely phenomenal. And my process of these things is to trial and error. Have I seen a progressive increase for the thing that I'm looking for? And if no, leave it on the back burner for now, but maybe try it again at a different point to see if there's a sequence that I need to figure out for me, because everybody's sequence to get from point A to Z is going to be different depending on the imbalances or depending on their way of life. And so I like to try and come through and focus on all of these things. And it sounds really overwhelming to start, but when you've done 5 years of university and you're going in to learn about accounting, you'd sit there and they'll say, cool, do this company's books. And you'll say, holy crap, that's too much information. I don't even know where to start. By the time you leave, you understand all of those things and it becomes a second nature. And learning about your body is the same thing. Do I wake up in the morning feeling refreshed? Have I had a good night's sleep? What are the foods that I can consume that will help me recover best? What is a good healthy exercise regime? Because I think a lot of the time we don't know how to move well, and then we're going in and we're doing weights. And because the right muscles aren't potentially loading, we're actually putting strain and stress back onto that structure, which falls down to the joints, the tendons, the ligaments, and we're not optimally loading the body. And I like to try and sit there and think that my strength training is building the muscle and the mass. I still want to be mobile and be able to go through ranges of motion, but we often get so tense and so tight from pushing really heavy weights that we lose our ranges of motion and we try and reach for things and we can't. But then all of a sudden, if you go to react for something, that's when we injure ourselves because the body isn't optimally prepared to go through those ranges of motion. And it's sitting there and having a conversation with yourself about, am I willing to sacrifice this to gain this? What are the things that matter to me? And for me, I want to get back to being able to run. I want to be able to get back to being strong and flexible and mobile. And I use science as a reference point for this, and I like to refer back to water because although the structure is the same, sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's liquid, and sometimes it's steam. And there's certain movements or certain times where, is this a strength exercise? Is this a endurance exercise? And deadlift, I want my structure to be strong. I want a very good force production through my whole body because I'm lifting a significant amount of weight. But when I go for a run, I'm not thinking about every single muscle that's engaged. I'm going through the motion, and I'll use the testing of 2 or 3 days post that to see how my recovery is, to see if I was optimally performing. And if I am, amazing, push, progress, overload. If I'm not, what can I do to strengthen that to reduce the amount of tension or the amount of discomfort on the body so that I can progress? Things like jumping, things like strength training, flexibility, mobility, slow and controlled movements like Pilates, because we have so many different layers to the body, a huge range of muscle. We're aware of the ones that sit over the top because we see them, but those deep layers of the insertions into the spine and how they support the vertebrae, and when we breathe and we open those up, and then when we contract, how do we complement those things? And so a lot of the time when I'm working with clients, I'll usually just pick on one thing at once, and I'll try and start with structure, and I'll try and target some big muscles to see, can you feel this? Is there a contraction? Is there an awareness? Because if I'm going to try and target glutes and you're predominantly using your hamstrings because you're lengthening over and you might be driving from the toes rather than from the heels, how do you work in those balance points to hold that awareness? Because I think we should be strong, and it's not necessarily about mass, it's about muscle density, and as we age that becomes gold. And I was talking about MoveU before, and one of the other coaches that I worked under while I was going through my injury stuff was a lady called Katie out of the United States, and she's got a business called Old Bull Athletics, and she has surrounded herself with these amazing coaches who are extremely knowledgeable, and their practice, from my observation, has been around preventative health movement, and is where I was really inspired for the structure of this brand, was to sit there and encourage people to do things intentionally so that when they're thrown into that ring of life and they have to respond and react, they're prepared. And so her and her team are extremely educated, but they also encourage people to progressively overload. How do you get stronger? But they then have the detail and the knowledge to go down to those finer details, because I sat in a call with her for probably an hour and we talked over, I was like, man, my hip's slightly rotated over this way, my foot's externally rotated, I can't get my right oblique, I'm struggling with a range of motion over my shoulder. And she just sat there and said, that makes complete sense. Let's do this, and let's do that. And for me, it was a really massive encouraging moment, because it was the first time somebody had told me that I wasn't overthinking it. And they understood the structure down to the depth and the nth degree to then give me some key insights, which was well and truly beyond my knowledge. I haven't studied to be a physio, I haven't studied down to the biomechanics, but a lot of this is my process that I've walked through training and injury, and I will always refer when things get too complex for me, because I can help to a certain degree. Once something gets beyond that, then I like to refer to certain people. I had a client come through a few weeks ago, and they were asking around blood work and how to go through all of this, and I referred them off to one of my friends, Ollie, who's based down in Wellington, and he has built this amazing team, this amazing process called Body Reset. And I honestly admire it, because one of the things that it comes down to is hard work and years of experience, surrounding yourself with better people, building a team that complements you in ways that you don't have access to, or you don't even have the time to, because the reality is some of the stuff that we've talked about today is extremely complex. And outside of those complexities, we don't have time to do it all. And that for me is where it comes back down to character, to sit there and say, this is my weakness. I want to surround myself with people who do succeed in this, and therefore this is who I'm now going to partner with. Is their track record? Does this work? Yes, no. Do we progress? Yes, no. How do we go through? If it fails, how do I reset? How do I try again? Because for me, a no isn't necessarily, dang it, it's not meant to be. There's just something I don't understand. And so when I look at the science, the body should be healthy and strong. We should be emotionally intelligent. We should be aware of our food consumption. We should be able to react with logic and control our emotions in a situation. We should be able to hold conversation and be aware of other people's environment, and just basic social skills that I feel like people aren't encouraged to do anymore or be challenged, because society's going in a way that says, oh, slightly touchy subject, let's not go there, you do you, good luck, we'll see you on the other side, rather than sitting there and saying, hey, look, I've actually noticed that your life's going in this direction. Like, is there anything you want to chat about? How can I hold you accountable to maybe coming into the gym a couple of times a week? How do I go about maybe teaching you some financial integrity? Because these are the things that stress will trigger from. If your mind is constantly running 24/7 and you don't allow yourself to step out of that high functioning state, what does that do to the body? If you're constantly training and you're pushing your body to your max every single day, and it's not having time to recover, what is that then going to do to your muscles, your tendons and your ligaments? And is something eventually going to go? How much wear and tear are you putting on your joints? Because it may feel fun when you're up to your 30s or 40s, but once you get post that, it gets really uncomfortable. But I also sit there and I look at science nowadays, and there was a company, I was reading a book, it was written by Tony Robbins, and it was recommended to me by one of my friend's wives, and they were talking around all of the stem cell, they were talking around the peptide treatments, and this was something that got introduced to me a couple of years ago, and I had a peptide treatment done while I was in the States for my ankle, and it was just a really interesting journey and process to go through. But they talk about how science is getting to the point where they can almost do these injections with nanotech or these peptides that will specifically help to reverse arthritis, and it'll help to regrow cartilage, because when you look at anything in life, it's held together by atoms, and those atoms They connect together, which then makes an element, and certain elements, when they're molded together, creates a substance. And so theoretically, every part of our body is just an accumulation of certain substances that make a construction point that then functions. And so if you understand that and you break that down to the nth degree, things like cartilage is just a chemical equation, but then understanding how to make that work and function, whole nother level. And as we go through these things and as we look at this journey and this process and how we go about it and what that looks like, this is where I get really, really encouraged, because I've started surrounding myself with people who weren't scared to have these conversations around my frustrations of health. I went through probably 3 years, and I've talked a little bit about this before as well, of genuinely max getting 4 hours sleep a night. What that did to my headspace, I was so wired and I was so on edge. My body felt constantly depleted. My headspace was really cloudy. My nerves were like extremely sensitive, especially before the operation. And everything was just hypersensitive, and it wasn't a fun space. The one thing that really helped me to get through that was having accountability into my work, because one of the things I don't like to do is let people down. And so I like to sit there and I like to over deliver, and hence why I've built this space. I use this space as a way to complement my rehab for the ankle, but to also be able to bring and deliver content more so around conversation. And I really want to get to the point where I'm inspired by people like A Diary of a CEO and Andrew Huberman, and I want to get really good at articulating conversations so that I can bring those sorts of conversations to everybody and share other people's strengths to then take out to people to help their lives get better so that they can be healthy, and then to optimally, theoretically, do more. Because if we're healthy, if our headspace is clean, if we have a strong body, we have a lot less resistance towards day-to-day life, and we have more time to take action. And if we're constantly taking action towards something that we're interested in, then we're going to go a lot further. And this is health and gym for me, and I'm very blessed. My philosophy growing up was I wanted to work on myself mentally when I was young. I grew up in an environment, only child. My mum and dad were never together. I was lucky that they were still in relationship. And so I still got to know my dad and my mum. And there were components of that where I just sat there and I was like, man, I'm missing out on a lot of connection with others. And walking through that process and understanding that journey for me was really interesting, because I was like, I'm born into this environment where I have to hustle. If I'm going to make something of myself, I'm really going to have to work hard. But I also got to the point where I asked myself the question, what am I actually missing out on by not having a functional family to be a part of? And so I was really blessed because I could spend time around families that had been happily married for 10, 15 years. They had multiple siblings, and I watched the dynamic of how much more they achieved together because they had that close network or that community. And that is part of what I want to build with this brand, is a health environment where people were like, I want to be associated with that because it's showing that I'm working on myself. I'm proud of this. I know that if I was walking down the street and I saw somebody wearing this, that I could jump in and be like, hey, me and you can have a chat. And that's that expectation that comes with the brand. And those are the sorts of things where we go through life and it's like, okay, your entry point to the gym, it might be Pilates. And it's like, I love Pilates. It's amazing for your base structure, small muscle fibers, working the whole body, time under tension, while then going through a range of motion. And then from there, I like to progress into strength training. And so if you can't handle your body's structure naturally, why are we then going and teaching people to go in and apply massive amounts of load, especially within like that 5 range to 1 RM? It's like, if you can't go through a full range of motion for multiple reps, then personally I wouldn't be progressing up to a failure rep or an ego rep, whatever you want to call it. And there's these different components of stages of life. And so for me, I don't train bodybuilders, I don't train powerlifters, and so I very rarely go anywhere beyond that 5 RM. I will go 5 RM all the way up to 30, and then also endurance training and cardio, because I don't need to be pushing my clients to that nth degree to find out what their 1RM is when they want to be able to show up for their family, be really strong, be really powerful, healthy, and be able to do life in the way that matters to them. And so as we now go into a little bit more of conversation around movement and the things that I've noticed over the last few years is compensation patterns. And there is a training method called the WEC method. Highly recommend teaching or going through their courses, because they teach really well around rotational training, and they use rope flow. They do a lot of kettlebell strength. They do a lot of rotational capacities. And for me, the ability to be able to stay fluid and move without injury and ranges of motion, to be able to reach, to be able to jump, to be able to catch, almost like a sports athlete. You've got to be quick and reflexology. They educate it really, really well. And I like the fact that they're not disturbing, but when you watch them, you know that they move really nicely. You can watch a big bodybuilder, and this is nothing against them, because like I said before, you choose what it is that you want, and it does quite often mean that you've got to sacrifice something else. But a bodybuilder, when they walk, they're quite rigid. They're extremely dense, they're extremely strong, and it's phenomenal the amount of determination and strength that goes into it. But it comes at a little bit of a cross point of mobility and range of motion most of the time. And the WEC method is teaching people, how do I flow? How do I go through a range of motion? How do I catch myself as I go through these movements? How do I create a recoil so that I'm moving through? And it was amazing, because I grew up thinking about structures, and I've talked about it a lot, but I never, until probably 2 years ago, had differentiated between the fact that the spine runs up the middle of the body and then the muscle structures at either side. And so, you know, you talk and you're like, okay, you're going to stay structured as you go into a squat, and it's like amazing. But actually, like, I can lift this side, and now my left side of spine is lengthened and my right side's contracted. And then I can lift my right side of spine and my left side gets contracted. And so when you apply that under load, if you have these imbalances, you're going to strengthen to your body's path of least resistance. And so if I've got one side of my body, which I do, which is slightly stronger than the other, then when I apply load to that, I'm going to really complement that growth and not necessarily work on that imbalance. So that's why I love functional training. You'll see a lot of what I do being rope pulls or sled pushes or pull work or alternating rows or off balance training or stability. It's because I want to test the foundation before I load it. And like I said before, it's a lot harder to build a foundation back once it's broken than it is to look after it. And so 80% of my training is actually really boring. 20% is me having some fun and trying some movements and doing these different things where it's like, oh, like, can I test myself to keep it interesting? I want to be able to fail, because if I fail, it shows me, and I mean this failing safely. Jordan Peterson says it really well. He's like, you want to allow people to do dangerous things safely. And within that, it's the same thing in the gym environment. How do I, can I do a 5 RM with a single dumbbell row, but then can I also do that 5 RM on the other side? And quite often one side feels smoother than the other. And it's like, well, what is it that contributes to that? And this is where I start to really watch the body. And simple things like the way that we grip, like you've got a nerve structure that runs up and kind of, let's just say, controls these 3 fingers, a nerve structure that runs up here. And quite often, especially with cell phones, we get these repetitive movements that create a movement pattern that's more dominant than the other. And naturally, I'm stronger with these 3 fingers than I am the outside 2. But on my left hand, I'm actually more dominant outside. And it's because I'm more rotated like this from walking for such a long period of time that became my dominant. And if I try and replicate this, it's actually quite difficult for me to do. I'm like, I've got to rotate the core intentionally. I then have to do that movement. And so for me, the game is to constantly try and offset those balances. Say I'm looking at a bar and we're coming through. Can I pick this bar up, centrally loaded, strong? Right side, yes. If I then come across to my left side and I pick that same bar up, not bad, but I felt a different load at the hips as I picked that up. And so I like to come through and I like to test these things. I like to make it a game because it keeps it interesting for me whilst I'm not being able to go running because of my ankle and walking through that whole process. So little things around like foot strength. Can I come up into a calf raise? Can I get that drive force so that as I cross center, that my big toe helps with the drive? Can I stand on the outside of my feet? Can I go into a squat? Can I go into an Asian squat and walk into that depth? And as you change through these different ranges of motion, I teach strength to a certain degree, and then for me it turns into a stretch. And so what is the function that I'm trying to achieve with this exercise? Because every exercise is a full body exercise, whether you like it or not. Whether you're running, even when you're training chest, the rest of your body doesn't switch off. It's still there, but you can optimally load the whole body and then target a specific muscle. So as we go through and we question these things, some of the things that I noticed from being off balance and post-injury that I never noticed before the injury was how weak humans can get. I used to be ridiculously strong, and I'm not being cocky, it was just a fact. I had always trained, I'd always moved well. I could go and run 10Ks and then be deadlifting in the gym, and I would go to sleep, wake up the next day recovered and know no difference. And then I did this injury, and small movements I would rotate and my back would hurt. I would be like, wow, like, man, what's caused that? Because there wasn't the structural support. If you think back to that triangle where the muscle was doing the role of helping me rotate, which is lengthening one side and contracting the other, it might have been switched off, or it wasn't structurally loaded like those bridge columns that as the car drives over, it hit a little bump or there was a weak spot and it couldn't follow through with the way that it was made. And so these little things resulted in nerve pain. It resulted in little muscle tweaks or little spasms. Sometimes it would be a sharp pain, or even like to the point where my neck, I would rotate and I'd almost feel like one of the discs was like catching. And so is that from there being an area that's so tight that it's having to overturn to get the range of motion because it's not complementing? And these are the sorts of things that I like to look at, because if you have, let's say, what's an example? You've got a string and you put, say, 4 O-rings on it, and you let that string drop to the center. All 4 are going to come to that one point. But the spine is designed, or the joints and the ligaments, to design to spread force evenly. And then you've got larger muscle groups which can create the power and the force. And then you've got these very, very small detailed muscles which then allow those micro movements that when you sit there and you twitch or you move, and they're the little insertions that kind of constantly just click and tick away, that, you know, even to just stand over to your left versus your right, it doesn't take a large muscle to do that, but there is a lot of small movements that's happening for you to be able to do that. When you look at your fascia and the way that your body has this network that talks and responds and shares all of this information, it's absolutely fascinating. And so some of the key practices that I like to focus on is my breath work. First and foremost, I had to learn this probably about 3 years ago, especially with the injury, because one, it helps with stress regulation, but it also encourages that diaphragm to move, create that height. And a lot of the time we breathe chest, but we don't actually have that core strength. And that was where I loved the Move You at, because they had a whole section just on diaphragm breathing, and it was phenomenal. They went into the depth of how do I breathe out into the rib cage, how do I contract and vacuum the core, where the diaphragm is, and all of these details around your the depth of core that is associated with it, like your transverse abdominis and the different muscle groups that are linked in to help you breathe and retract. So I highly recommend checking them out. But then process of breath work is, I try and complement in these extremes. So I do cold plunges and I do sauna work, and I use these breath techniques because if I'm in a cold plunge, it makes you want to react because it's so cold and it causes that stress response. So when I had the impact injury, my body had to protect. It was like, holy crap, I don't know what this is. But eventually what starts to happen is you start to self-regulate within those extreme environments. And then when something in life happens, I'm less likely to react, because out of that extreme to the life extreme, it's not as bad. And then also with heat, because in that heat, things expand. And so you're going to be hypermobile in those heated environments. Your muscle density or your contraction points aren't going to be as strong in integrity, because when things heat up, they expand. And then like in the cold, they contract. And so if you can learn to breathe in a contracted position and regulate, versus being in that kind of lengthened and that comfortable position and still regulate, the breath work then translates across to other areas of life. It was key for me because, one, it taught me that when I would walk and I would trigger a nerve, I would hit like a spike to a 10 of pain. And honestly, it just got to the point where I was pretty much just done with life. I would go to work, I would come home, I would just lie down and not want to do anything, because I would just have sharp pains running up my leg for hours and hours on end. And it was the micro movements. The game for me was, can I find where I need to position my toe, the angle I need to put my ankle to relieve the tension off the damage that was done in the ankle, so that the nerve could just have that breathing spot just for a second. And then I'd have to mentally recoup and I'd say, okay, time to go again. And so those processes of understanding that those micro imbalances are going to cause impingements over a long period of time. But also just the encouragement of simple things like nerve flossing. It's a technique I learned from one of the physios that I saw. And it's just something really simple of like, there's not a lot of muscle movement, there's going to be an extension and a contraction, but there's no load. Can you go through these ranges where you simply just get the nerves and everything to slide through their sheaths inside without having to use the muscle? Because if we get constricted in our motion and an area becomes really, really tight, and then you try and go through that range of motion and it's not comfortable, then imagine a cable or some nerve signaling, and you crimp a cable together and it kind of gets that coiled effect, and then you try and pull that back out. There's going to be a time in between that restoration where it's actually just going to be really uncomfortable. And this was something I wished people had told me, as I would sit there and I'd have these nerves firing, or I would extend a muscle, and at some points my muscle imbalances were so tight it felt like a joint was going to pop, because I'd try and go through a range of motion and to go through it would stop, but then I found one muscle would actually become really weak and it would open it up. And then I was like, came into biomechanics, and it's like, oh, actually, like, if I want a door to open and the hinge is slightly off and it's hitting the top, I don't yank the door through. I tighten the screw that pulls the door back to being straight so that it can move through its range of motion optimally. And then from there, you repeat a range of motion while intentionally putting yourself in that spot. And eventually the body will take that path of least resistance. That layer starts to switch back on. I get a better contraction and it helps me to move. And I started to really, really go down to these finer details around foot placement. If I'm standing in this direction and then I try and squat, how is it going to affect the mechanics of the hip and the core? And it's like, okay, well, with a sumo stance, I want to be slightly wider stance, but I'm going to be more hinged forward, because then the glutes and my center of gravity is dispersed. So when I'm training weight, where is my plumb line? What is the center of weight? Because I don't want to be shifting across these ranges of motion as I'm doing load on the body. I'm trying to figure out how I can structurally target something while going through and then retesting it. And that's your progressive overload. It's not sitting there and being like 5 different variations of deadlifts, go. It's like, actually pick one, test it, see how you go, find your strength points, find your weaknesses, complement it, and then progress. Because I think the guy's name is Sayat Fitness on Instagram, and I absolutely love coaches that are real. They call out the crap and they compliment the good stuff. And we go through phases, and I've been guilty of this, because when I coach clients, I'm always like, man, I really hope they're not getting bored with their training, because I want to keep it interesting. I want to keep them motivated. But I do cycles of 6 weeks with most of my clients, and over those 6 weeks, there's probably 4 or 6 workouts, and they rinse and repeat, because you learn the movement, you test it, you then try and grow the muscle, you grow the strength, and then we progress. We don't sit there and say every single week of the 6 weeks is something different, because otherwise, how are you going to learn where you're at? You don't go and do an accounting degree and then all of a sudden do a test in computing. you retest your knowledge at the start, or you build up the knowledge to then see if you pass, and then you progress. And life and health and training and all of these, if you use this mindset, I see a massive progression. So it's a lot of talk. There's a lot of stuff that we can sit there with, but some of the key things for me has been light exposure. Andrew Huberman talks about getting sunlight first thing in the morning. Sets your circadian rhythm. It helps to regulate the chemicals in your body around a sleep pattern. I also try and put my phone down 1 hour before bed at night so that I'm not having screen time and my brain's not triggering those responses, because we didn't really start to have technology start to come into our existence of distraction. And quite often we go to bed, we're on our phones, we wake up in the morning and it's the first thing we grab. And why are those habits there? Do you have the discipline to sit there and say, I can actually put my phone down an hour before bed and I'm going to spend time with my partner and we're going to talk about the day, or I'm going to journal and figure out, how did my day go? How am I feeling? Where am I at? How's my body doing? Because those time of days for me are some of the most valuable, because it's where I tune into myself. And that skill of self-assessment, I always look at coding, and I worked in pool chemistry for quite a while. It was one of the certs that I got when I was younger. And you constantly have tests that you do. Is the chemical level of chlorine here? Is where's this level at in the water? Sodium bicarbonate, like what's the value of the pH? Like, how do we work these things through? And we should be doing that with our body. I think it's wise. So, did I sleep well? Am I feeling strong? How's my digestive system? One of the things that I encourage people to do if they've got gut issues is check their own poo. And it sounds disgusting for a lot of people, but science doesn't lie, and your body's really efficient at what it does. So depending on what comes out the other end, it actually tells you a lot. And it's why doctors ask, like, how are your bowel movements? Because there's a story that's associated with them. And so it's also one of the reasons why I love blood work, because you sit there and my lack of knowledge is explained with science. I sit there, I can't fake a blood test. The understanding that it's going to be different at the morning versus the evening, especially post-food, post-day, is key. So I always try and make sure that if I'm getting blood tests done, I get them done at the same time, because then I've got an accurate marker base point. Am I fasted? Have I eaten? What time of day do I try and get that done? Because I want consistency so that the variable that I'm testing against isn't swayed by an over-consuming force. As I go through, can I at least get, I used to say 10,000 steps a day back when I was extremely active, but genuinely 5,000, because life is busy. I genuinely work probably 12 hours a day, and to get out for 10,000 steps, I genuinely struggle with it, still on the ankle as well. And so I would like to say 10,000, but I'm somebody who teaches what I practice. And so 5,000 for me is achievable. I probably vary between 5,000 to 7,000 most days. And so it's getting that fresh air. It's grounding into nature if you can. Take your shoes off, walk on some grass, just get earthed for a little bit, because what that does with the ions in the body and how it allows stress to just relax a little bit and breathe, especially when it's complemented with sunlight, is really, really good for the health. And so those are one of my key steps, is it's wake up in the morning and try and get sunlight. Try and make sure I get grounded in a few thousand steps a day, and always try and get some form of resistance training in. And because I'm not pushing to my 1 RM day in, day out, I'll target certain muscle groups, but the muscle group that I want to be building, I will try and train it 2 to 3 times a week. I'm not going to absolutely destroy it, because then I'm going to have so much soreness for the rest of the week around that muscle group. And for me, it just increases stress on the body. And I would much rather progressively add these 1% layers on top rather than force a 10% growth. And intentionally for me, I want to be able to show it with my life. I want to be able to be clear-headed, and I don't mind playing a 5-year-long game that's going to see me progressing. So what are some of the things that I think about, especially when coaching people? The setup, extremely important. Do you have awareness of what muscle we're trying to do? If I'm doing a row and my trap is taking most of that load because I'm shrugging up, how do I cue that awareness? How do I set the core? How do I engage my feet? how do I build? So your hinge movements, your squats, your lunges, and your push and your pulls are kind of the main core function of movements that I'll teach people. Because if I am doing a squat, great. If I am coming through and I'm pushing a sled, I'm almost in that hinge movement with the push and then going through a lunge range, which then gives just people an awareness, because when I'm coaching people, I'm not making them the top athlete. I'm trying to build an awareness that if they go in and they're about to pick something up, they're like, oh, I'm going to hinge to get this, or I'm going to squat, because they have a common reference point. And so for me, education is key. And so these small things, try and get quality sleep, start your day this way, try and get some resistance training and phone down an hour before bed. If you can, cross out any sort of blue light, just to try and help set you in. I actually put a candle by my bed at night, and I light that because it helps me to just relax that a little bit more rather than having really bright lights on. I try and make sure that my food is as clean and natural as possible, and what that will do over 6 months can genuinely change most people's lives. And that's what this brand is it's sitting there and it's saying, if you do these things, it is going to complement your lifestyle. And health doesn't lie. When you look at people, you can see what their body tells you about them. I hold a lot of wrinkles on my face, and it's because I'm constantly frowning or I'm constantly running so much through my head, and it's like, okay, cool, that's the reaction or the byproduct of the way that I do my life. I sit there and I look at people's necks and structure or the roundedness of their posture, and it tells you so much. The way that somebody can articulate, you know if somebody's educated versus not. And it's not around their intelligence, but it's around the expansion of their mind to be able to articulate. And I think that that's extremely important as well. And so as we sit there and we look at things like hormones or skin health and what that then does to a person, and it actually is getting quite hard in today's world because there's so much Botox and there's so much of all of this stuff that's coming into play. But genuinely 9 times out of 10, when you look at somebody and you spend some time around them and you understand a little bit, you understand a lot about that person if you actually have the eyes to see. And so you follow their habits, you follow their way of life, you follow the things that they do, and action, outcome, is this trait something that I want to have in my life? Do I want to be surrounded by this person? And my biggest strength is consistency and reliability. And so I sit there and I will always make it in here. I will constantly find a way to do some form of exercise, because for me, my long-term goal is that when I have kids and I get married one day, I want to be able to show up for them in a way that motivates them to do better. I want to be able to have intellectual conversations that they can come to me and say, hey Dad, we had something really weird happen today and we'd love to chat to you about it, rather than being closed off, because I'm aware of the generational changes that happen. And also within fitness and well-being as well, like how do you prepare when kids are young? They don't have the muscle density, they're extremely fragile, and you watch them run like little goobers. And how do you then encourage movement at that level that's safe? Which is why so often there's age limits where they're like, I probably shouldn't put kids under load until they gain some form of structural awareness or integrity. But things like reflexology and movement, great, make it play. And then as you start to go into your adult years, you start building that muscle, you start getting that strength, you've developed your bone structure, and you learn a little bit about yourself, and then you can start to progress. And then as you get older, it's like, well, probably in the 20s to 30s, you should learn a little bit about mobility and ranges of motion. But then from there, it's about remaining mobile. And if you've built your strength and then you focus on remaining mobile, those two complement really, really well, because you're going to be far more efficient than, and in all honesty, I don't know the accuracy behind this, but my observation is that muscle is a mineral density that your body can use as a resource. And so the more muscle I hold is the more availability my body has when it needs to call on it. If I lack that muscle, I'm constantly having to get so much more from food. And so I almost kind of sit there and think about a bear in hibernation. You collect the food, you do all of that, and then I've stored for the winter, which is my muscle, what I need, so that at any point if I need it, I have it available and my body can call on it because I'm prepared. And so I would much rather be prepared than caught out. And for me, that is health. That's this little regime that I've listened to a lot of content from people who do research, and I've applied it to my life to then see, is this effective, is it not? And then from there, is it also effective for other people, or is this just my circumstances versus theirs? And if so, what are the parameters that cause it to affect me this way and them that way? And that's the curious mind. I think we should all remain curious. It's why the 3 pillars of my business is science, education, and community. Because with community, you can hold these conversations and you can be transparent. This worked for me. How did you find it? What was it that worked? You have some people that are higher functioning individuals who need that challenge and they need that motivation and they need that drive. And then you have some people who aren't that, and it's like, well, I'm not going to push that person to the end limit because it'll probably break them, but I can encourage them gently from this point so that they progress. How do we go through preparation? What creates an environment when you're young and you're adventurous? Rhythm and routine isn't as vital, but as you start to get older, you seek that level of comfort. Like, I'm 31 now, and I'm really at the point where I'm like, I want to get a home that is going to be a base for a long time. I travel a lot with work. I work a lot as well, and I'm at the point where I'm like, man, like, I really want a place or a space that I'm proud of to call home. And I've got the business and I've got all of this, which I'm extremely proud of, but this is a work environment. And so I like to segment my life that when I go here, it's a place to switch off and I can relax. When I'm here, I'm to get this done. When I do this, it's that space. And that intentionality of how I go about that preparation, because like we said, when we study for exams and we start with accounting day 1, if you were to then go and study a business and say, hey, look, do the accounts, you're not prepared. But eventually it becomes second nature, and then that second nature, it actually frees up your headspace. It'll take 80% or 90% of your headspace for a long period of time, but eventually it starts to make sense, and it'll go 70%, 60%, 50%, 40%, 30%, 20%, and then you've actually freed up 80% of this headspace. But most people get to the point where they're like, cool, I've built this, and now all I'm going to do is look after it. And it's like, well, what are you going to do with all of this extra resource that you've gained? Try and find other things that you're interested in. Try and test. Try and keep life as this adventure. You might find you're into music, or you're into poetry, or you're into cooking. Like, create a story and become the person that you're proud of being, because we compete so often with each other. And it's something that I find extremely sad, is the mental aspect of what brings a lot of people to the gym is brokenness. You sit there and say, hey, look, I'm not feeling too good about myself. I've let myself go a little bit. I've been through breakups. I've been through a really hard time at work, and I kind of just want to reinvest in myself. And so there's all of these different things that bring people in. And it's like, well, what would happen if we complimented one another and we just said, hey, good on you for being here. Here's some advice. Let me know how you go. And these are the things for me where it's like we should be complimenting rather than competing, because we get so much more. When I refer back to that only child versus siblings aspect, you have arguments as siblings, but it teaches you to have conversation. You're less likely to shy away. You sit there and you have generations. If you're lucky, you've got grandparents, you've got parents, you've got siblings. They might have kids, so there's younger kids around. So you're multi-generational. What that then does is you've got these different trends from each of these generations that then allow you to have awareness of the stuff, so you're less likely to be caught out. What are the things that are really important here? What are the things that are really important here? How do we go about it? And so these are just parts of the conversation that I like to hold around health, so that you're less likely to get caught out, or should something happen, you're encouraged that, oh, I got down to 20% of my capacity, but I need to reallocate to 60 to offset what's just happened, and therefore I can reassess this 40% and try and juggle around what I need to make the rest of life function on that whilst I focus on that. I spent 3.5 years completely almost going dark. I just went in and I spent that time focusing all in on this rehab stuff. I had to learn around nutrition, counter-inflammation, stress regulation, pain management, trying to maintain muscle growth when everything hurt, headspace, joint load, nerve pain, all of these different things. And so I genuinely didn't have much capacity for anything else whilst I was going through that. But I was very blessed because I'd spent the younger years of my life being around good people and preparing myself mentally. I had really supportive people that I could just go and hang out with, or have a little bit of a whine or a moan to, and then show up again and just do it again the next day. And it's all what's led to this, and it's what's led to these conversations, because within these conversations, it's led to me building the training app. It's led to me releasing the online platform so that people can go and learn to the more detailed engagement of, like, when I'm gripping, what happens is if grip disengages, how does that affect muscle intensity? How does it affect the integrity of load on the joints? Because if I'm going to go and put a bar on my back and I'm going to have 60 kgs and my arms are just hanging there, I'm losing out on some very important support structures as I go through that squat. How do we go about understanding these things in a way where we build awareness that should something not feel right, or a muscle switch off through a range of motion because we exceed its range of motion and something else takes the load, do we have the wisdom to step back? Do we have the awareness to notice that shift? Or are we just bouncing the body through ranges of motion from muscle activation, stretch, tendons and ligaments going through an extended range using elasticity to then pull back up and back into the muscle contraction? Whereas I could actually just get 10 solid reps of muscle contraction, which encourages muscle growth, and then I finish with a lengthening exercise where I've optimized that engagement of the muscle engagement, and then I've optimized movement. So a lot of chat, but these are some of the things where I go through with people, environment, I go through headspace, preparation, habits, mental aspects of, hey, look, like, you know, one of the things that I've been like having a lot of conversations around recently is like women and their like post-pregnancy and what happens to the core, and how many people don't have awareness of pelvic floor. Or even within dudes, understanding that, hey guys, you still got a pelvic floor just because you're not a woman. It's like you've still got to strengthen and learn that structure, because if your alignment's out or there's that disengagement, it's genuinely the sway point. And I've really noticed from the injury like how much your hip strength is so vital. And if I can't get a good core engagement, what's going to be the thing that compromises when I'm under load and I'm doing training? And breath work was a huge part of that as well, was learning to inhale and bring oxygen into the body and then to contract and breathe that oxygen out. And so there's all of these different conversations where it's like you're taking into consideration age, you're taking into consideration the life journey, you're taking into consideration a person's sex and the environment that they've been in, because on the chemical level, that matters. And so from there, how we go about these different things and we approach them is all conversations. The intensity level that you can train at when you're younger and your cells can recover versus when you're older. And so there's all of these different parameters that for me is absolutely fascinating. I haven't even really gone into ranges of motion and mobility and all of that sort of stuff, but there's been a lot of information in today, and I wanted to drop in something that's going to encourage people. It's like, you're probably going to feel some form of discomfort. How do you then bring back to your center? How do you get that strong again? If you're working your way back through injury, keep at it. Find different stimuluses that are going to complement muscle growth so that you can then build back stronger. As you go through life, or what is your posture? There's not necessarily a bad movement, but the one that you spend the most time in is going to become your path of least resistance. So if you're constantly hunched over or you're always on your phone, how do you offset that to straighten your posture up and try and undo those habits that get formed? Why should you do difficult things? Because what does that do to your mental capacity, and how do you grow that? So I hope this has been beneficial. I hope that as I continue to release these, for me, the goal isn't to explain everything in one podcast, but that I can build out a consistent database with different professionals over time that then fill in little pieces that might click at this point, or it might even be 5 years down the line. But I really want to encourage people to be healthy, because when health is compromised, life's genuinely not fun. When your environment is really crap, life's just genuinely not fun. And so I think that when you take these things and you intentionally work towards them, it doesn't matter. We all have different starting points, but you get to the point where you actually become really complacent and you get to the point where you become really content and you're like, wow, this is beautiful. And life for me is genuinely one of those amazing things. And with my travel with work, and I get to go and meet all of these people in these different cultures and these different countries, and you have conversations and you see the different strengths of different people. It makes you realize how sophisticated we are as human beings. And different sports have got different priorities, or different lifestyles have got different priorities. And all of these things, is one of them right, is one of them wrong? Depends on what it is that you want to achieve and what you're aiming for. So I hope that you're encouraged to remain curious. I hope that you're encouraged to find or seek answers around your health and well-being. That just because one person may not have the answer, it doesn't mean the answer is not out there. I have my strengths and my knowledge based off my experience, but it doesn't mean that your question, which is outside of my awareness, doesn't validate the fact that it's there. It just means I don't know something, and I'm totally okay with that, and that's why I like to refer. So remain curious, seek multiple bits of advice, because I think that that's one of the biggest things, is that I get really excited with AI because it has access to so many bits of information that me as an individual human could never achieve in my whole life. There's too much to know. So there's this amazing tool now that's starting to come through, and I've seen a couple of different health models that are integrating AI, be it from scanning, blood work, nutrition, exercise regimes, all of this stuff, where it's understanding the individual person's component of life. You look at smart tech that tracks your movements, your sleep, all of those things, even your heart rate and your blood pressure and your VO2, your oxygen levels, and all of those sorts of things is just absolutely phenomenal. So I'm genuinely really excited for the future. And even for my ankle, I would say I'm probably only at 60% of the way, but I know that if I maintain my strength and my integrity, probably within the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be solutions that weren't even on the table back here because technology wasn't at the point where I can understand what it is that I'm trying to figure out. And so be encouraged, and I hope that this finds you well.